Welcome back to the deep dive. This is where we take that really dense stack of sources you hear about and boil it all down, give you the essential info, perfectly informed.
That's the goal.
And today, wow, we are wading right into what you can really only call a cultural battlefield. It's pretty fierce.
Mm-hmm.
We're looking at this conflict, pitting one of the, most beloved literary worlds ever created against, relentless modern reinterpretation, corporate adaptation, and some very organized academic.
Yeah.
We're diving deep into the scouring of Tolkien, basically analyzing this coordinated, multi-front war over the ownership, the meaning of Middle-earth.
It really is a remarkable tension, and our sources, they map this out with almost like surgical precision.
Right.
For hundreds of millions of people, J.R.R. Tolkien's world isn't just a story. It's foundational modern mythology. But yeah, there's this very specific, very articulate, and highly organized critique aiming to deconstruct that legacy.
So what do we got? What sources are we working with here?
We've looked at quite a range. Articles, university course descriptions from major universities, mind you, detailed fan counter-arguments, corporate strategies, the whole shebang.
Okay.
And they all lead to this central question. Who actually gets to define what Middle-earth means now, in the 21st century?
So our mission today, just to be clear, is to go beyond those headlines, really unpack the precise, specific critiques being used.
Mm-hmm.
Everything from those long-standing allegations of racism tied to orcs to, some pretty radical attempts to retrofit the text with modern identity politics.
Yeah, some really out there stuff.
And crucially, we're going to weigh these critiques against the material itself. We're drawing on everything from the really obscure foundational lore in the Silmarillion.
Deep cuts.
Right through to the cold, hard, global sales figures, which are pretty staggering.
And what's absolutely fascinating here as you dig into the sources is that this whole thing, it's much broader than just Tolkien, right?
Oh, that's...
Well, this conflict reflects a much larger cultural struggle. It's about the relentless reevaluation of classic literature, the big arguments over cultural ownership, and this whole idea of decolonizing established canons.
Okay, that term decolonizing, we'll need to unpack that later.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Because when a work gets as massively successful globally as The Lord of the Rings, it stops being just a book.
It becomes something else.
Exactly. It becomes a cultural monument. And monuments, historically, they become targets, don't they? Targets for people who want to challenge the fundamental assumptions of the age that built them.
So we're basically studying a high-stakes ideological tug-of-war.
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
And like so many of these modern culture wars, this one just got thrown into the global spotlight, massively amplified by the entry of a massive corporation with seemingly endless cash.
Yes, the elephant in the room.
Let's jump straight into that, the modern catalog, the Amazon factor, and how this corporate adaptation just poured gasoline on the ideological fire.
Indeed. Amazon, a company that famously started out selling books.
Right, the irony.
They saw this colossal monetary opportunity in big budget fantasy. Our sources, they confirmed that the owner, Jeff Bezos, reportedly really wanted Amazon to have his own Game of Thrones, but critically, with a built-in audience already there.
And the money involved?
Yeah.
The scale of the investment alone statement.
Oh, absolutely. The sources highlight that Amazon paid a staggering $250 million.
$250 million.
Yeah. And that wasn't to make the show. That was just for the rights. Just to get access to the world. That was the entry fee.
Just for access.
Yeah.
That figure, it kind of frames everything else, doesn't it? Because that money was spent specifically to tap into that fan base. Mm-hmm. The millions of dedicated readers who loved The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion.
The core audience.
Yet our source material, it frames the adaptation that followed, The Rings of Power, as, and this is a direct quote from one source, a billion-dollar disaster and failure. And paradoxically, that it gave the activists absolutely everything they in terms of the ideological mess.
And that's where the conflict with the audience really kicks off. The production, it seems, right from the start, took this kind of adversarial stance against the established fans.
How so?
Well, once the backlash started, and the sources indicate the creators were, fully prepared for it, maybe even expected it.
Right.
The strategy seemed to shift. It effectively cast the long-term invested core audience, the people who bought the book, as the enemy.
Which seems counterintuitive.
It's perhaps the most self-destructive adaptation strategy you could imagine. Pay $250 million for access to a dedicated audience and then deliberately push them away.
We actually have some specific, pretty controversial quotes from the producers that really lay bare the thinking behind this strategy.
Ah, yes. Lindsay Weber.
Producer Lindsay Weber, defending the casting, the design choices, she famously said, and I'm quoting directly from the source here, "It felt only natural to us that an adaptation of Tolkien's work would reflect what the world actually looks like."
Okay, let's unpack that statement for a second. The critique in the source material is immediate. It's structural.
What do they mean by structural?
They mean Tolkien wasn't writing about modern Earth. Right. He was creating a secondary world.
Right, Middle-earth.
With specific, meticulously built internal logic, its own lineages, its own cultures, derived from his specific mythology for England. So to insist an adaptation must reflect the world outside Middle-earth, modern, multicultural 21st century London or LA.
Is to fundamentally ignore the internal world the author spent decades building.
Exactly. It's ignoring the very thing they paid $250 million to get access to in the first place.
But the rhetoric, it got much more hostile than just, a debate about artistic direction.
Oh, much more.
The source material notes reports, and we should stress, these are reports that the showrunners themselves, J.D. Payne and Patrick McKay, allegedly escalated things by calling fans who were unhappy with the adaptation
Patently evil.
Patently evil, that's strong language.
That level of open hostility from creators towards their own established fan base, it just suggests this profound ideological disconnect, doesn't it?
Yeah, it feels like any critique of the art or the narrative choices was immediately reframed as like a moral failing by the fans.
Precisely. And then you had statements from cast members that really cemented this idea that the show had some kind of social mission beyond just telling a story.
Right. The source highlights the actress Sophia Nombate, who played Disa, a dwarf of color. Mm-hmm. And she stated that her role was, quoting again, "a necessary redress of balance within this world and an honor."
See, the emphasis there shifts, doesn't it? It moves from let's create compelling fantasy to let's rectify perceived political or historical wrongs within the story itself.
And this intentional ideological framing was immediately picked up, amplified, reinforced by the media surrounding the show.
Oh, definitely.
Suggesting that the prequel's main goal was to actively confront what some people saw as, baked-in racial issues within Tolkien's original work.
Absolutely. The media discourse was intensely focused on race and identity.
Yeah.
Right from the initial publicity push.
Yeah.
Our sources cite specific article titles that really show this framing, making the ideological mission pretty unmistakable.
Like what? Give us some examples.
Okay. Well, we saw titles like A New Lord of the Rings prequel quietly confronts an uncomfortable legacy.
Quietly confronts. Already implies there's some dark secret, some flaw in the original that the show is bravely exposing.
Exactly. And then you get even more explicit stuff, like how Amazon's The Rings of Power prequel grapples with the deeply ingrained ideas of racial difference and racial determinism in J.R.R. Tolkien's world.
Racial determinism. That's academic language, is directly accusing Tolkien of believing race dictates destiny or morality.
It is. Very loaded term. And then, of course, the article that became probably the biggest flash, the one that showed the sheer hostility aimed at the traditional audience.
Ah, the infamous one.
Dear Tolkien fans, Black people exist.
Wow. Just wow.
So this entire corporate effort, with its massive budget, it just became this lightning rod. It pulled all these existing critiques, which were maybe confined to specialized academic journals before.
Right, niche stuff.
And slammed them front and center into mainstream media content, which dramatically shifted the conversation from, is this a good show, to, is the source material itself fundamentally racist?
Which is why we absolutely have to move away, just for a bit, from the corporate adaptation and look at the academic roots, the ideas that allowed this critique to be so easily picked up and run with.
Exactly, because these attacks on Tolkien, they're genuinely not new. They've been brewing for decades.
That's a key point, the source. These allegations are long-standing. They even predate the Peter Jackson film.
Oh, yeah. For instance, let's look back at a key modern precursor. From 2002, there was a Guardian article titled Wraiths and Race.
Wraiths and Race. Okay, what was the argument there?
The critique was remarkably straightforward. It suggested The Lord of the Rings is racist, based purely on the visual descriptions applied to the bad guys.
Like the orcs in Easterl.
Primarily. The critic noted the baddies having dark skin, broad faces, and dreadlocks, and then concluded, quote, "Perhaps I better come out and say The Lord of the Rings is racist."
Just flat out stated it.
Flat out. And this specific line of critique, focusing on the appearance of evil characters, has now been formalized, within university courses.
Right. And the formal academic critique, it has a very specific technical-sounding name for this line of argument, doesn't it? Often seen in course descriptions.
It does. It's often referred to as the anti-African antipathy, or AAA.
Anti-African antipathy. Okay, let's define that for them. What exactly does the AAA argument propose when looking at Middle-earth?
Well, the sources indicate this argument is being taught, for instance, in course material at the University of Nottingham.
Okay.
It basically suggests that Tolkien's depiction of evil characters follows this tradition of AAA, where evil is somehow coded using tropes associated with African peoples. Or, alternatively, that the orcs and other dark-skinned antagonists should be seen as victims of ethnic chauvinism.
So the central claim is that Tolkien, whether he meant to or not, basically equated darkness of skin with moral darkness or inferiority.
That's the core of it, yeah.
And it seems like there's, almost an entire industry building up around this. The source highlights the publication of a 2022 book called Tolkien, Race and Racism in Middle-earth by Robert Stewart. Tries to sort of codify this whole argument.
Right, and here's where the source material provides those quite telling data points, sort of a reality check against the noise surrounding the issue.
What kind of data?
Well, it notes the book's performance in the market. It costs $93.43.
$93?
Yeah, which suggests it's priced for academic libraries, or very specialized readers, not the general public.
Fair enough.
And at the time the source did its analysis, it had only 3 reviews on Amazon, with a pretty low average rating, like 2.6 stars. So this financial data, this popularity data, it's used by the source to argue that while these critiques might be loud within certain academic or activist circles, the broader market, the general readership, they're simply not engaged, or at least not buying into them financially.
So the source is basically arguing that the perceived urgency of the problem isn't really matched by actual public interest or validation.
That's the implication drawn, yes.
But the real detailed argument, the core of the debate, it has to rest on the interpretation of the orcs themselves, doesn't it? If we're seriously discussing alleged racial stereotype, we have to move beyond just projecting modern ideas onto the text and look at Tolkien's own words, because he was, let's be honest, obsessively meticulous about his creations.
Oh, incredibly so.
This is where the deep dive really...
Right. The source material focuses intensely on Tolkien's own description of orc, specifically from Letter 210.
Letter 210.
When was that written?
1958.
It was written in response to a proposed film treatment someone had sent him. He was very controlling about the details, even for his villains.
Okay, so what did he say? How did Tolkien himself describe orcs?
He described them as, and this is a direct quote, squat, broad, flat nose, sallow-skinned with wide mouths and slant eyes.
Yeah, that is incredibly, it's a very clear physical picture. But then he adds the crucial, the really controversial phrase that's become the absolute center of the modern debate.
Yes, he says orcs are, quote, degraded and repulsive versions of the 2 Europeans' least lovely Mongol types.
Mongol types. Okay. We need to slow down here and really unpack that specific because, as you said, it's kind of a double-edged...
It really is. The source analysis points out 2 key things immediately. First, Tolkien himself seems to acknowledge the potential for offense. By adding that qualifier to Europeans' least lovely, it suggests he knew the term Mongol type wasn't complimentary, even when creating monsters. He was aware of the baggage it carried.
Okay. That's the first point. What's the second?
The second part is the source's really definitive counterargument. If the physical description, squat, sallow skin, slant eye, is being used to allege racism against black people,
right,
and Tolkien himself explicitly connects that description to Mongol type, then who, logically, should actually be offended by that description?
The source argues it should be Asian communities.
That's the source's contention. If anyone has a beef based purely on that specific description and comparison, it would logically belong to Asian community. They even draw a connection to historical figures like Genghis Khan, whose armies had massive destructive impacts across Europe, and linking the monstrousness of the orcs to a historical enemy figure that Tolkien, as a historian himself, would have certainly studied.
And the source takes this argument even further, right? It performs some kind of calculation.
Yeah, it gets really granular here, trying to emphasize the specific nature of the intended comparison versus the projected offense. They suggest only about 0.5% of the male population on the planet could reasonably trace lineage back to, and thus potentially be offended by, the historical association with Mongol figures like Genghis Khan.
Referencing historical texts where Khan was described as a, quote, big murderer.
Exactly. Trying to pin down the actual reference Tolkien was likely make based on historical context.
And this leads to that really profound pivot in the source conclusion. We really need to spend time analyzing this next step.
Okay.
Tolkien describes orcs as humanoid, but explicitly not. They have sallow skin. They were created by Morgoth, the first Dark Lord, as a hideous mockery of the elves.
Right. Corrupted elves, essentially. That's one of the origin stories.
So if modern readers look at that description, squat, sallow skin, slant eyes, with Tolkien's own reference to Mongol types, and they immediately interpret that as a description of black.
Then the source concludes those readers are, quote, telling on themselves.
Telling on themselves. That's a sharp conclusion. Explain that.
The argument is that the reader is projecting a specific modern racist caricature onto Tolkien's deliberately non-human fictional creation, that the interpretation reveals the reader's own pre-existing biases about what physical characteristics they associate with evil or ugliness.
So the source is suggesting that by leaping immediately to a comparison with Black people, the critics are, ironically, employing the very racialized framework they accuse Tolkien of using.
That's precisely the argument. The core tenet of the defense presented in the source is that the critics are judging a mid-20th century author by hiker-specific 21st century standards, while simultaneously ignoring the historical context and, crucially, the author's own known moral positions.
Like his documented opposition to racial doctrine and Nazism.
Exactly. They argue the critics are trying to excavate offense by ignoring context, ignoring the author's intent, and ignoring the specific references he actually made, replacing them with their own projection.
Okay, that structural failure in the critique, this focus on, let's call it superficial color coding, it forces us immediately into the deep lore, doesn't it?
It has to.
Because the whole allegation that fair skin equals virtue in Middle-earth, or that it operates on some simple racial binary, well, that's just easily destroyed by actually reading the texts carefully.
This is the counter lore section. And for the source, this is the absolute heart of the defense. It is just rich with detailed counterexamples that directly challenge the simplistic morality that critics claim defines Middle-earth.
Because Tolkien wasn't writing a simple fable.
Not at all. He was writing a complex mythology where evil is presented as a matter of moral choice, of spiritual corruption, and it's accessible to all races, including the fairest.
Okay, let's break it down. Let's start with the dwarf, generally described as fair yet ruddy, definitely non-human. Are they morally spotless?
Absolutely not. The sources remind us the dwarves include some famous figures of deep moral failure. Take Mime, the petty dwarf.
Mime from the Turin story in the Silmarillion, right?
Exactly. Mime's story is tragic, sure, but his actions are undeniably evil in the context of the story. He notoriously betrayed the location of his hidden home, Aemon Rud, and later he betrayed the great human hero Turambar himself.
And his motivation.
Greed and revenge, classic Middle-earth vices. It clearly shows that fair skin, deep lineage, none of that guarantees virtue.
And the dwarf's capacity for evil, it went way beyond individual betrayal, right? It extended to, well, literal regicide within the mythology.
Oh, yeah. We absolutely cannot forget the great tragedy in the First Age involving the dwarves of Nogrod.
The killing of King Thingol.
Precisely. They were responsible for the death of the great elven King Thingol, High King of Doriath, and why? All over a piece of jewelry, the Noglamir, the necklace set with a Silmaril.
That murder is such a catastrophic moment in the lore.
It triggers a war between elves and it's a pure act of avarice committed by these fair-skinned dwarves, driven entirely by wealth and possession. This incident killing an elven High King over treasure is maybe the clearest example that Tolkien used internal corruption, greed, not external appearance, to drive tragedy. Dwarves are fully capable of profound world-altering.
Okay, so the dwarves aren't morally pure. What about the elves? They are the fairest, seemingly the most enlightened, immortal, high-culture race. Surely they.
Nope. Perhaps the most morally compromised of all, if you look at the grand sweep of history.
Really? More than men or dwarves?
Arguably, yes. Because their falls from grace have the most catastrophic consequences. The entire history of Middle-earth is fundamentally shaped by elven sin, by elven pride and poor choices.
Give us a prime example.
Fëanor, the greatest craftsman of the Noldor elves, the guy who made the Silmarils, the jewels that contain the light of the two trees. His actions are just monumental acts of pride, possessiveness, and destructive obsession. His greatest failure, his oath in pursuit of the Silmarils, led directly to the kinslaying.
The kinslaying at Alqualande.
A cosmic crime in the lore. The first time elves killed other elves.
That is the ultimate act of elven moral failure, isn't it? It's not just a battle. It's a cold-blooded betrayal of their own, driven purely by Fëanor's insatiable desire to reclaim the Silmarils.
It is the original sin, the stain on the entire history of the Noldor elves. They commit murder against their own kin, the Teleri elves. They steal their ships. They burn the ships later to prevent others from following or retreating. And they openly defy the Valar, the angelic powers, essentially defying the gods.
And these actions, committed by the most physically beautiful, the most light beings in the world,
resulted in their exile from the Blessed Realm, their doom, centuries of war and suffering. If Tolkien truly believed fair skin equaled virtue, Fëanor and his sons would be heroes, not these cursed figures whose terrible oath caused immense destruction across 3 ages of the world.
And Fëanor's sin, it's compounded by other examples of treachery by fair-skinned elves, too. The source mentions Maeglin.
Ah, Maeglin. He is the absolute epitome of internal corruption leading to disaster. He was a Noldoran elf, highborn, fair, highly placed within the hidden city of Gondolin.
Gondolin, the last great elven stronghold in the First Age.
Exactly. Yet, driven by unrequited love for his cousin Eadril and lust for power. He betrayed the location of this greatest secret fortress of the elves directly to Morgoth, the original Dark Lord.
And that led to
the total downfall of Gondolin, one of the most tragic losses in all of elven history. Again, this isn't an orc betraying them. This is a fair-skinned, high-ranking elf committing high treason out of personal bitterness and ambition.
Okay, so we have dwarves driven by greed, elves driven by pride and lust. This brings us to men, specifically the men of the West, the Numen, initially presented as virtuous, given long, but their history is also one of spiritual corruption, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The sources really emphasize that the temptation towards evil is universal in Tolkien's world. Even the ancestors of the most virtuous men way back in the past were apparently sacrificing other humans to Morgoth. And as their own civilization, the great island kingdom of Numenor, grew proud and then declined, their descent into evil was just spectacular, total, culminating in the literal destruction of their entire island by the Valar.
And within that history, we find the group known as the Black Numenorians. Critics sometimes seize on that term black, a racial element, but the lore is
very specific. The source makes it crystal clear. The Black Numenorians were not racially black. They were fair-skinned Numenorians who had consciously chosen the path of evil.
So black refers to their morality, not their skin.
Exactly. They became oppressors, wicked lords, establishing dark kingdoms in places like Umbar and Harad in Middle-earth proper. They are defined by their moral failure, their embrace of Sauron's ideology, their practice of dark arts, their tyranny not by their genetics. They were a fair race that fell entirely to darkness and then became tyrants over darker-skinned peoples in the south and east.
And then we absolutely cannot forget the ultimate figures of fair-skinned corruption, the ones who represent universal human failure when tempted by power, the men who accepted the 9 rings of power from Sauron.
The Nazgul, the ring-wraiths.
Yeah.
They are the perfect illustration of how power corrupts anyone who desires it too much. They were originally great men, potentially kings, sorcerers, warriors from various hue and cultures, likely including Numenorians.
And fair skins, presumably, given their origin.
Presumably, yes, drawn from those powerful realms. And they were entirely consumed by the temptation of power offered by Sauron through the ring. They're now pale, spectral, undead, utterly enslaved to evil. Their appearance is defined by their moral state or lack thereof, not their original physical race.
Okay, so the source material does acknowledge that armies of Easterlings and men from Harad fought for Sauron.
Yes, it acknowledges that.
And their complexions match the regions they lived in because Tolkien, accounted for basic geography and environment in his world building.
Right. He was consistent with his own invented world's law.
But the crucial counter, the one that ties this whole counter lore argument together, is irrefutable based on...
It really is. While men from the east and south often fought for Sauron, sometimes due to historical oppression by Gondor, sometimes trickery, sometimes fear, sometimes genuine allegiance.
Right. Complex reason.
The fair race of Numenoria, the men who had the greatest gifts, virtue, and opportunity initially. They also fought for Sauron. And in fact, they became his most dedicated, most powerful, most wicked human servant, the Nazgul and the Black Numen.
So if we step back from all this deep lore, what does it actually prove about that core academic critique, the one about race? And
it means the source material presents a pretty devastating counter-argument to the idea of a simple racial or color binary in Middle-earth. The source really emphasizes again and again, it wasn't black and white.
Metaphorically.
Metaphorically, yes. There was a lot of moral complexity to Tolkien's work. Evil in Middle-earth is shown as a matter of profound internal spiritual choice. It's about pride, greed, despair, lust for power. And the fairest races, elves, men of the West, dwarves, have consistently produced the greatest, most world-altering villains.
But this complexity, this nuance, precisely what that academic frontline seems determined to ignore or flatten or just erase entirely.
That's the contention.
Which brings us right back to that academic frontline. Specifically, that history module mentioned earlier at the University of Nottingham, Decolonizing Tolkien and Others. This, according to our sources, is presented as the absolute peak, the sharp end of the modern organized.
Yeah, the sources frame it that way. And the sensational framing of the module's intent is kind of perfectly captured by that headline cited in the source.
The telegram.
Yeah. Students shall not pass unless they accept Lord of the Rings is offensive. Now, whether that's literally true or journalistic hyperbole, it strongly suggests the objective isn't balanced inquiry.
Right. It suggests the goal is the forced acceptance of a specific, predetermined ideological viewpoint about the text supposedly flawed nature.
Exactly. And the course is led by Dr. Onanubi, a historian and writer, and the source notes she's advanced this specific, quite controversial narrative that medieval English towns and cities were actually as racially diverse as modern London.
Okay, that historical perspective is critical background because it reveals the lens through which approaching Tolkien.
Who, as we've noted, was very consciously an Englishman trying to create a mythology for England, drawing on Northern European sources.
Yeah. So first, we really need to contextualize that, decolonize. What does it actually mean in academic?
Generally, it means re-examining or moving away from white Western viewpoint. The idea is to incorporate or prioritize perspectives from cultures or groups historically marginalized by, colonialism and Western dominance. The stated goal is often to correct a perceived imbalance. Stories and histories get value.
And this is where the source launches its central and pretty powerful critique of that academic intent when applied to.
Right. The argument put forth in the source is basically, why would you want to move away from the viewpoint of Professor Tolkien when studying Tolkien?
He's the author.
He's the author. He was an English, writing a mythology specifically for England, using his English viewpoint, partly to counteract the cultural dominance of, say, classical Greek or even Norse myths in England.
So the source asserts this effort isn't about neutral re-examination or just adding perspectives. It's about something else.
The source argues it's about outright deconstructing the work, or even, ironically, colonizing Tolkien himself, imposing an external ideology onto his creation.
And the module's stated goal, you mentioned repopulating the canon.
Yeah, the stated goal is teaching students to repopulate the canon of British myth and legend. The source interprets this phrase very critically. They see it as aiming for destruction, stripping the stories of their original context and meaning, particularly their anti-modernist themes, rather than simply adding new perspectives or conducting scholarly exploration. It views the original structure itself as the problem to be dismantled.
And it's not just Tolkien in the crosshairs here. Dr. Nubia's critiques go further.
Apparently so. The source mentions she also targets other major figures in English literature, C.S. Lewis, Milton, even Shakespeare.
Okay, so that's significant. It suggests this isn't an isolated attack on one fantasy author, but part of a more systematic effort to reevaluate, or as the source frames it, deconstruct the entire foundational canon of English literature.
The cornerstone figures who kind of define that tradition. Tolkien is presented not as an anomaly, but as a key pillar in a perceived ideological structure that, from this critical perspective, must be challenged, dismantled.
Which brings us to the absolutely essential question about the ideological stakes. Why Tolkien? Why is he such a central, persistent target? Why not focus on, historical texts with far more overtly problematic content?
Our source material is very explicit in its assertion about the underlying reason. It argues it's not just the text, it's the man himself and his values.
His personal belief.
Yeah. Tolkien held deeply conservative values, right? He was a devout Catholic, he was a proud Englishman, in a sort of old-fashioned, non-jingoistic way. He was profoundly anti-modernist. And he had this deep distrust of large-scale government, of industrialization, of technological progress for its own sake.
Values embodied in the Shire, basically.
Exactly. And these values, the source argues, are fundamentally antithetical to the ideology of the modern activists and academic critics, who often promote progressive, sometimes revolutionary structural change, and are generally more aligned with modernity.
So in this view, Tolkien's works aren't just fantasy stories anymore. They're seen as monuments to a set of conservative values: humility, agrarianism, legitimate monarchy, tradition, faith.
Precisely. And the source material culminates in this really powerful summary quote about these ideological stakes, labeling the entire effort as cultural demolition.
Okay, let's reference that quote directly, the one the source's analysis highlights.
The source quotes a commentator identified as the culture explorer on X, who summarizes this defensive position perfect. Quote, "Forget education. This is cultural demolition. The goal isn't to re-examine the past, it's to poison it. This isn't a debate about orcs, it's a war over who owns your culture."
Wow, poison the past, war over who owns your culture. Strong stuff.
Very strong. The logic presented by the source here is that the timelessness and the sheer massive popularity of Tolkien's story and the conservative traditional values they subtly promote stand as this kind of unwelcome, constant reminder that the more revolutionary or deconstructive views of the detractors are maybe not as widely shared by the general public as they may.
Right. That deep ideological conflict then leads us to what the source calls maybe the worst case, the struggle happening within the very ends that were originally established, observe, and promote Tolkien's work.
Oh, right.
We're talking about the Tolkien Society, which isn't some fringe group. It's an established educational charity founded way back in 19...
Yeah, this highlights the internal conflict, doesn't it? Almost like a civil war within the fandom, or at least within the organized structures around it. The source points specifically to a series of seminars held by the Society back in 2021.
2021, so this was even before the Rings of Power debuted.
Exactly, predating the Amazon show's main impact. And the titles of these seminars, they demonstrate a pretty clear focus on applying modern critical theory specifically around identity politics directly onto Tolkien's canon.
And the source emphasizes the well, startling nature of some of these titles, attempts to inject concepts into Middle-earth's mythology that seem, on the surface at least, functionally absent from the original text.
Yeah, let's look at some of the specific examples cited from that 2021 seminar series. The scope is quite broad.
Okay.
You had one titled Gondor and Transition, a brief introduction to transgender realities in The Lord of the Rings.
Transgender realities in Lord of the Rings.
That's the title. And the critique in the source isn't just about the subject matter itself, but about the basic feasibility. The source expresses, let's say, genuine incredulity about how one could generate a whole 30-minute academic seminar out of a concept that simply wasn't present or addressed, explicitly or implicitly, in the works of a devout Catholic professor writing in the mid-20th century.
So the argument is it's trying to find the reality of modern identity politics within a deliberately created, historically inflected secondary world where those concepts didn't exist.
That's the source's interpretation of the attempt. And other titles followed this pattern, seemingly retrofitting the world with modern academic concerns. Things like The Invisible Other, Tolkien's Dwarf Women and the Feminine Lack, or The Problem of Pain, portraying physical disability in the fantasy of J.R.R. Tolkien.
Okay. So using Middle-earth more as a container for modern concepts rather than studying the world on its own terms.
That's the critique leveled by the source. But perhaps the most jarring examples cited, the ones that caused the most stir, were those directly related to sexual identity.
Right. There were a couple of those mentioned.
There was one called Something Mighty Queer, Destabilizing Cis-Heteronormativity in the Works of Tolkien.
Destabilizing cis-heteronormativity.
Okay. Which kind of set the stage for the specific seminar that the source really digs into. Pardoning Sauron the Queer in Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings.
Pardoning Sauron. Wow. That title alone seems to encapsulate the goal of deconstruction, doesn't it? Taking the ultimate figure of evil and trying to reinterpret him through a modern, perhaps sympathetic identity lens.
Exactly. And this is where we need to analyze how the source vividly illustrates this deconstruction process in action, using a specific textual example.
Okay, how did this pardoning Sauron argument work according to the source?
Well, the specific interpretation cited in the source focuses not on Sauron directly, but on Saruman the White.
Okay, Saruman, the fallen.
Right. Saruman, who starts as Saruman the White, head of the order, but then falls to evil. Later in the story, he reveals his new identity, casting off the white and calling himself Saruman of many colors.
Right, I remember that.
Okay, so the academic critique discussed in the source apparently interprets this shift from the singular pure white to the complexity of many colors as a metaphorical rainbow flag.
Seriously, a rainbow flag, like the modern LGBTQ plus symbol.
That is the interpretation presented and critiqued in the source material. They're taking a character who's explicitly defined by his betrayal, his pride, his fall into corruption and collaboration,
and reinterpreting his choice of many colors, which Gandalf immediately condemns, as somehow a positive statement about identity complexity.
That's the essence of the critique highlighted by the source. And here is where the source material brilliantly uses Tolkien's own text to argue against this kind of deconstruction. They use Gandalf's canonical response to Saruman right in that moment as a metaphorical summary of their view on the entire academic project.
Okay, remind us. When Saruman declares, "I'm Saruman the Wise, Saruman of many colors," what is Gandalf? Gandalf is still Gandalf.
Gandalf delivers this profound rebuke. He defends the virtue of the simple white, arguing that, quote, white, it serves as a beginning. The white page can be overwritten on, but the white light can be broken, in which case it is no longer white.
Okay.
And then comes the absolute defining sentence, the one the source uses almost as its rallying cry against this type of analysis. He that breaks a thing to find out what it is has left the path of wisdom.
He that breaks a thing to find out what it is has left the path of... Wow. That quote is devastatingly appropriate in this context.
The sources certainly think so. It uses this line to encapsulate the whole idea that attempting to break Tolkien's carefully constructed world down into its component parts, searching for modern identity issues, reducing Saruman's profound moral corruption to some kind of statement on sexuality or identity politics, fundamentally destroys the original moral and philosophical meaning of the work.
It's presented as an act of folly, not wisdom. Breaking the thing, losing the thing itself.
Exactly. It connects perfectly back to that notion of cultural demolition discussed earlier. The source argues the academic critique tries to break the white light to analyze the individual colors, but in doing so, they lose the unifying strength, the coherent, the meaning of the white light itself, the whole truth of the story as Tolkien intended.
Okay. So this entire ideological academic struggle, it's all happening against the backdrop of what is undeniably one of the greatest, most enduring commercial and cultural successes all of literary history.
Absolutely. The critiques are loud, yes, but the data on popularity is just deafeningly clear.
Before we get to the big numbers, though, it's vital to reiterate that point the source makes about Tolkien himself. That he was intellectually and morally opposed to the very concepts like racism that he's now promoting.
Yeah, the source emphasizes this. He was explicitly against things like racial doctrine. He famously clashed with a German publisher in the 1930s who demanded proof of his Aryan descent to publish The Hobbit.
Right, he basically told them where to go, in very eloquent terms.
He did. His moral compass was firmly set against the actual racism of his time, against National Socialism.
Yet, despite his actual history, despite the nature of his work, which largely promotes themes of humility, resistance to tyranny, the value of the small and local against centralized power, he has somehow been flagged as potentially dangerous by actual government bodies. We need to spend a moment on the sheer absurdity.
It's quite something. The source mentions this disturbing report from The Spectator magazine back in February 2023. It concerned the UK Home Office's counter-extremism program called PREVENT. Apparently, a unit within PREVENT drew up lists of dangerous books.
Dangerous books. Seriously. Dangerous in what way? What were they claiming these books could prompt?
The claim, according to the report cited, was that reading these books could potentially prompt or indicate support for the far right, or perhaps even more bizarrely, support for Brexit.
Support for Brexit from reading Tolkien.
That was the reported concern. And the authors specifically named on these lists, well, they were foundational titans of English literature. George Orwell, Joseph Conrad, C.S. Lewis, and yes, J.R.R. Tolkien.
That is staggering. That an author whose entire work arguably focuses on the small, humble individual overcoming vast technological centralizing evil, the Shire resisting Sauron and Saruman's industrial machine could be considered potentially extremist. And it just shows how far ideological interpretation has drifted from text.
It really does. It feels like an indictment of the current climate, this fear of established traditional narratives.
It showcases how this kind of cultural anxiety, maybe spurred on by some of these academic critiques filtering out, can lead to genuinely baffling policy.
Yeah. But the ultimate counterpoint to all of this noise, all this critique and controversy, it really comes from the global commercial reality.
Yeah.
The hard data absolutely supports the source's core argument that these detractors, however vocal, operate in what seems to be a minuscule minority compared to the readership.
The numbers are just staggering. They're undeniable. Let's lay them out. The Lord of the Rings has been translated into 57 different languages.
57.
With at least 87 total translations globally, accounting for revisions and different editions. That is the very definition of universal cultural.
It's incredible penetration culturally.
And the sales figures, they're just monumental. They place the work firmly in the absolute pantheon of global literature. The Lord of the Rings has sold over 150 million copies worldwide.
150 million.
Just let that sink in. Put that in perspective for you, the listener. That figure makes it, by many reliable estimates, the third or fourth best-selling book, usually excluding religious texts of all time, globally.
That's more copies than the entire population of most large European countries. All reading a book that a small, albeit vocal academic circle is calling fundamentally flawed or offensive.
And if you combine those staggering Lord of the Rings sales with The Hobbit,
which is often people's entry point.
Right. The total volume of just those two works sold reaches around 250 million copies, 250 million books. This is a work that has permeated virtually every literate human culture on an almost unparalleled scale, which strongly suggests its resonance transcends specific national or cultural boundaries.
And that's before you even account for the massive impact on cinema. The film revenue alone just reinforces the sheer commercial power of this intellectual property.
But what are the film numbers?
The source notes that Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings trilogy and The Hobbit trilogy combined have a worldwide gross of $5.875 billion.
Nearly $6 billion.
And that's unadjusted for inflation.
Wow. So that volume of enduring popularity, 150 million books sold, nearly $6 billion in film revenue. It suggests a pretty universal cross-cultural appeal, doesn't it?
Certainly seems to.
It severely undermines the assertion that the work is somehow fundamentally offensive or ideologically toxic for the vast majority of people who actually engage. If anything, it suggests the opposite.
A powerful, maybe even universal recognition of the moral drama, the characters, the world of Middle-earth.
Okay, so let's try and synthesize everything we've covered today. How does the source material pull all these threads?
Well, to synthesize, the source material we've analyzed maps out this really clear ideological battle. You've got academic reinterpretation armed with critical theory meeting corporate adaptation, which is often driven by, let's say, ideological box checking or reflecting modern sensibilities.
Right.
And both of these forces are attempting to claim or dismantle or modernize a mythology Middle-earth that partly due to its sheer depth, its specific embedded values, and its massive popularity, kind of resists easy manipulation or up.
And the sources argue this campaign isn't really about objective scholarly study.
The sources argue it's less about study and more akin to cultural demolition, specifically targeting those conservative, anti-modernist values that Tolkien consciously embedded in his work. That's the core argument presented.
The argument presented, as you said, is that activists are trying to tear down Tolkien's work as, quote, just one more monument to tear down. But if those numbers are accurate, 150 million copies sold, 57 languages, billions at the box office, we are left with a final provocative question for you, the listener, to really chew on.
Okay, so if The Lord of the Rings is perceived by this small, but admittedly very vocal group as being fundamentally problematic, maybe racist, maybe offensive, what does the enduring, massive, and truly global popularity of the work actually signify?
Does this universal, almost unquestioned appeal suggest that maybe these ideological critiques are inherently limited, perhaps confined to a very specific, narrow cultural or academic context, maybe entirely divorced from how the vast majority of the world actually reads and engages?
Or does the constant, persistent, and highly organized need to problematize such an overwhelmingly successful work, a work that, let's face it, will clearly outlast all of its current detractors, does that need simply prove its immense, maybe even threatening cultural? Does it make Tolkien an unavoidable symbol in this ongoing war over who owns culture, whose stories matter, and what values they represent?
We leave that final thought with you as you contemplate the long and clearly ongoing war over Middle